Welcome to the Vanderbilt Philosophy Department interviews. I'm here with Jacob Barrett. This is your second year with us here in the Philosophy Department. Yeah. Jacob specializes in social political philosophy, do some work in normative ethics, and also come with a real specialization in politics, economics, and philosophy, the PPE.
Yeah, in some order.
In some order. I did that in the wrong order. The E is supposed to come at the end, economics. So Vanderbilt for 2 years, you came to us from the postdoc position at the Global Priorities Institute there?
Yeah, that's right. I spent 3 years there.
And before that, PhD at Arizona?
Yep.
And then and then a BA in philosophy at Queen's, right?
Yeah, Queen's in Kingston, Ontario, up in Canada.
Ontario. All right, the Canadians coming down.
And we're taking over the department.
Well, yeah, you're very welcome with us. You're very welcome with us. So how'd you get into philosophy, Jacob?
Yeah, so I guess sort of incrementally, maybe. So, as a kid, I was sort of always interested in like philosophy stuff. Like, I remember I was always worried about color inversion. Like, what if I see red and it looks blue to you?
Cool problem.
Yeah. Actually, that was in my writing sample for grad school. The same problem.
Persistent.
My uncle bought me like a philosophy for kids book, and so I already had like a positive association from a young age. But like, I was more into like Star Wars or whatever. Like then in high school I took a couple classes and I liked them, but I didn't think I was going to be like a philosopher. And so I went off to undergrad thinking I'd probably come back and be a lawyer or something. But I knew I kind of had philosophy, so I signed up for a few courses. And I took this great intro to political philosophy course with Christine Sipnowich, which at that point sold me on the major, not on the life. Yeah. And so then, time went on. I had summer jobs doing sort of legal related stuff. And I found I just liked the philosophy classes like much better than the legal stuff. Roughly because I thought in law, the game was something like you have the conclusion you want to get to and you have like a set number of premises, like the statute you should get to there. And philosophy was like unconstrained. Like any premises
where are we going?
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever premises, whatever conclusions.
Now I sometimes wish I had more constraints. But, then I finished undergrad and I said, I'm not going to go to law school, at least now. Like I'll apply to sort of a few PhD programs in philosophy. If I don't get in, take a gap year work or something. And I applied to something like just like the top 10 lighter or something. And then as an afterthought, I was looking through, my applications were out. And I saw University of Arizona. I said, oh, that's ranked high in political philosophy. Maybe I should apply there too. So I, expedited, documents, like it was after everything else was done.
Yeah.
And then I got on the wait list there, got off wait list very late, and got in, and I was like, okay, I guess I'm doing this. And here I am.
It's Tucson instead of a gap year.
Right, exactly. Here I am, yeah. Then I got there, and I was like, oh my god, it's so hot. It's
yeah,
a terrible mistake.
Gap year in a cooler climb.
Yeah.
So high school philosophy, can you tell me a little bit about what that looked like? High school exposure to philosophy?
I wish I remembered it better. So if I remember correctly, we had a professor, Mr. Wilson, who was mainly the math teacher, but also occasionally taught a philosophy class. And, I can't even remember exactly what the content was. I know we read a little Rawls, like I can remember that.
Okay.
Like Aristotle, I think maybe like, arguments against God or so, or for against God. And I remember most of my classmates did not really like it, but I loved it. And so I thought, maybe I'm a little...
Okay.
Yeah,
so
and then it was
early hook sunk.
Yeah, exactly.
Super interesting. So that's great in terms of just getting some early exposure in high school. And it's interesting that you said that you read some Rawls then. There's a lot of Rawls going on now. And so one of the things that seems to be one of your main research programs is this ideal, non-ideal theory. Can you tell me a little bit about what that debate is?
Yeah, definitely. So I think part of the problem with answering that question is people mean a million things by it. So I'll tell you what I mean, if that's all right.
It's a good place to start.
Yeah, so I've actually just finished drafting a Cambridge Element on ideal, non-ideal theory. So these are like these sort of short survey-ish books.
Super.
And so I can tell you how I set it up there, which is, I say sort of the core debate about ideal, non-ideal theory is what is the value of theorizing about ideal or perfect justice, or generalized ideal perfect democracy, or ideal, something else. Mainly it's about justice. And lots of different questions arise out of this question. So firstly, would the value have to be practical? Is that ideal theory somehow guides actual practice? Knowing what perfect justice tells us how to improve our own world, or even what attitudes to have towards it? Or could it have sort of non-practical value? And then the main thing I focus on is, supposing you want it to have practical value, what are various functions it might play? So could it serve as a benchmark that helps us evaluate what's better or worse than what? We the maybe too silly, maybe I'll cut it, but at this point, the sort of analogy I'm going with in the element is there's an old story that Charlie Chaplin once lost a Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest.
That's hilarious.
I can't figure out if it's true. It was reported in the newspaper.
There are versions of this with like Adele and Dolly Parton and
And I point out that thing that's so, making it not funny anymore. What's the criterion you use when evaluating who's a better or worse lookalike of Charlie Chaplin? It's who better or worse resembles the ideal candidate, Chaplin, right? So in the same way, you might think that, what makes a society better or worse, it somehow better resembles the ideal society. So that's one sort of view. Another sort of view is that the ideal serves as a long-term target for reform. So maybe we can make evaluation of what's better or worse, more or less, just without knowing what the ideal is. But if we just sort of improve things where we are, we're going to get sort of stuck and not end up eventually at the ideal.
Okay.
And then third view, which is sort of less often sort of picked out, but I think covers a few different sort of elements, is that ideal might serve as what for now, for lack of a better term, I'm calling sort of a gauge of propriety, a gauge of what's appropriate. So not what's better or worse, not what not what sort of serves as a long-term target, but what means are permissible or what attitudes are fitting to take towards justice or injustice. And maybe the ideal, maybe what matters, for example, is that we can take more significant or more violent or more aggressive means when it comes to combating more severe injustice. Maybe more severe means further from the ideal in some sense. And so that's sort of what the debate is about these sort of issues. Does it have to be practically relevant? Is it practically relevant in these ways? And my basic line on all of this is, the ideal theory probably helps a bit with all this, but not that much. So I try to get the sort of middle ground conclusion, which is you're overstating your point if you think that the ideal is necessary to play any of these roles.
Okay.
But also, in reflective equilibrium, we're going back and forth between different types of judgments. Sometimes it might end up being relevant, and it sort of goes too far the other way to say it's totally useless.
So saying that the ideals are absolutely necessary, or necessary conditions, that's overstating the case. But saying that you don't need them is also overstating.
Well, I
the
guess
case.
I guess.
Which way does that?
I guess I want to say you don't need them, but they can sometimes be helpful.
Okay.
Right. So here's just a toy case. Suppose you're trying to figure out an ideal theory of justice, and you're like an old school utilitarian, right? Or at least you're considering the view. You think so. In the ideal society, we'd maximize well-being, and then you really have a standard argument. Then you realize, maybe under certain conditions, if we maximize well-being, we'll allow all this terrible stuff like rampant inequality or even slavery or something. Then you might think, well, that couldn't be ideal. And so there must be something wrong with this criterion that's saying, just rank things by how much well-being they have in them. Now, actually, I think there are good responses to these objections, the utilitarian case, but that's just one example of how thinking about sort of a limit case, what's the best, can sometimes inform your judgments about sort of the whole ranking. Well, if all that matters is well-being, that would be the best, but that can't be right. Right? So that sort of thing can happen. But I just don't think that that's sort of the main way we make progress on these issues. So one sort of thing I try to argue is that very often when ideal theorists make the point that, thinking about the ideal society plays some important role, maybe that's true, but the same could be true about theorizing about dystopia or about science fiction. These all sort of constrain our theorizing in various ways. And I think the ideal theory is really just like one thought experiment among many, rather than something really central to doing political philosophy.
So this sounds like it's a kind of a tempered non-ideal theory.
Yeah.
Right? But it's one that still is putting sort of goals beyond, you might say, just the sort of... I mean, the one where the ideal theorist response to the non-ideal theory is that it's like it's a kind of a hand-to-mouth... It's got a hand-to-mouth problem, that you don't have any principled or any sort of consistent solutions, and so you're just sort of swatting at a lot of problems and not actually building something that's stable. Or so. But it sounds like you're thinking about like some kind of longer term goals and non-ideal theory. It's saying like we've got things that are supposed to somehow be stable ideals that emerge, but not ideals in the bad sense.
Yeah. I think that's right. So the thing I just mentioned, the Cambridge element, that's sort of much more survey-ish. But I'm also working on will be working on, was working on it, pause, will be working on sort of other sort of more substantive book on the topic, on precisely this question of, suppose you sort of buy my arguments against ideal theory, still they have lots of good points, like we should worry about having a principled approach to doing anything, we should worry about long-term goals, not just sort of right in front of you, hand-to-mouth as you put it. You don't want to just always solve problems right in front of you, sometimes they interact in problematic ways. And so the sort of the projects are trying to figure out, well, suppose, set aside this stuff about should it be practical, suppose you want to do practically relevant work, suppose you want to figure out sort of how to promote justice over the long run or other social values over the long run, how should that work? And the very rough idea is sort of in a pragmatist direction almost, sort of an experimentalist direction. What you've got to do is sort of figure out institutional arrangements that are more conducive to experimentation, to learning, to selecting for better things when they come up, and sort of canceling those that aren't.
Okay.
And so the orientation is, it's not the problems right in front of us, but it's also not sort of some particular long-term goal you eventually want to get to. It's sort of figuring out how, as I put it, how to get better at getting better, how to be more progressive in the sense of conducive to more improvements. And that's sort of the big project that I dissertation was sort of on that project, put on hold for a bit, then decided I'd do this sort of Cambridge element survey thing, sort of get myself back in that headspace, get up to date in the literature, and then once that's done, it's due in December, then I'm back to the big one.
Due in December, so you gotta pivot date.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's great, and so maybe a question about, so you'd mentioned that this is continuous with, or it looks like it's a kind of a pragmatist approach here. How informed is any of this with the? I mean, this is a little bit of an unscripted question. But, I mean, how pragmatist is it, or is it sort of steeped in that sort of American pragmatist tradition, or is it pragmatist in the more sort of standard analytic philosophy sense? We're just like, well, we're sort of not. We're going to just look at what works.
Yeah. So I think it's a good question. I mean, it's definitely. I haven't done like historical work on the American pragmatist. Now I know people in our department know this stuff very well, so I got to talk about it.
I said the P word around here. It's going to happen.
I'd say it's maybe more pragmatist inspired.
Yeah.
So I read a ton of Dewey back in grad school.
That's good for you.
And I always found that like the very high level broad stroke stuff, I was like, this is really cool and inspiring. But when I really tried to dig down, I wasn't sure if I always agreed with or fully understood the sort of moving.
I understand that problem.
Yeah. And so it's sort of like, I would say like Dewey is sort of one of the sort of like inspirational heroes of the approach, but I don't plan to sort of talk about his particular views, except maybe the occasional helpful quote or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
Other sort of, big inspirations would be like Mill's experimentalism, to some extent, Popper, to some extent even Hayek, various people sort of had this sort of experimentalist approach to long-term reform. Where Dewey is one of them. Yeah.
Right, and so and in this regard, it's about, in some ways, being most evidentially informed as to what's been working and what's actually effective.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and so maybe another kind of intersection here with non-ideal theory is the fact that, like, we've got another research project that you've got, which is about the fact that, like, we've got a lot of theorizing about the states, but then we have a lot of non-state actors, in particular philanthropists, who are doing a lot of good, and they're doing a lot of good in, again, this kind of piecemeal fashion. But you think that this is, in some ways, like, hey, people are doing a lot of good. This guy's got a problem with it. What's the problem with people doing good, man? Yeah, what's the problem with philanthropy?
So I'm all for doing good. It's interesting you mentioned that. Yeah, so I spent 3 years doing a postdoc at GPI, hanging out with a bunch of effective altruists, and so I got me thinking a lot about philanthropy, the good sides of it, the critiques of it, and so on, and I sort of got interested in this literature of sort of democratic critiques of philanthropy. Very roughly, the idea goes something like, who are these rich philanthropists to tell us how to spend, taxpayer money? Because of course you get tax deductions or credits from doing philanthropy. Sort of money that would otherwise go to public funds is coming out to incentivize philanthropy. Yeah. Obviously, the more money
so they're effectively spending it then.
Right. Well, you hope it's effective. You hope it's effective.
Maybe.
Yeah. I got interested in sort of these democratic critiques, and also how I didn't actually think they applied very well to one of their main targets, which was the effective altruists, often.
Okay.
For the reason that effective altruists are often focused on sort of three main groups. People who, the global poor, those in extreme poverty throughout the world, animals, and future people. And, very controversial how much weight to give these things. But anyway, just those are sort of three groups they focus on. And it occurred to me that democratic critiques of pursuing, trying to help these groups seem to fall quite flat to me, even though I buy them in other contexts, for the reason that these are three groups that are disenfranchised from democracy,
yep.
Right? Or at least, disenfranchised from wealthy democracies, And so I sort of noticed this sort of interesting phenomenon where on the one hand you always critiques of effective altruism and philanthropy, and on the other hand I thought in some sense they were sort of targeting exactly the wrong thing. Yeah. Worry about philanthropic funding for public schools and stuff, sure, that also comes up.
Yeah.
But when it comes to groups that are disenfranchised, I thought it was sort of less plausible. And so I have a paper project, Philanthropy for Disenfranchised. It's called trying to make this argument that even though we should take certain democratic critiques quite seriously that sort of undermine political equality in some cases, the cases where the critiques don't land so well are those where philanthropists are trying to benefit groups that are not well served by the democratic process. In a slogan, for the people, by the people is quite a rousing slogan.
Yeah.
But for the people, by those other people is not so rousing, right? So, like, why should we get to have a say in what happens to other people who are disenfranchised?
Yeah.
And so I thought those sort of critiques don't work as well in this case, and try to build sort of a story about sort of what this means about how philanthropy should be organized and this sort of thing, to sort of more towards helping groups who aren't enfranchised by the democratic process. And so, yeah.
And so in some ways it's a kind of a modification, or if maybe even would you say that it's a modification of the democratic critiques, or you'd say that it's a response to the democratic?
Yeah,
I mean, what exactly is the valence of this?
Yeah,
it's kind of a both and.
Yeah, so lots of my stuff is this, like, it's not useless, but it's not useless. So this is supposed to be like, how do you thread the needle of, on the one hand, wanting to make room for philanthropists to do good. You don't want. It's better that philanthropists spend money on charity than on consumption, for example. I think most of us agree. There's almost no one, except for one negative referee I got, who's like, we should ban philanthropy altogether.
Awesome. Reviewer 2, man. Yeah. Shout out to you, buddy.
On the other hand, you can feel the concern, like, when you see all these examples of, one of the classic examples is Mark Zuckerberg's attempts in Newark to sort of influence the public school system in a certain way. We wouldn't say that just in virtue of someone's large amount of funding, they should be able to choose how the public school system goes. But you can effectively do this in certain cases through strings attached grants, right? And so what I want to do is sort of thread the needle in terms of finding a type of philanthropy that both did a lot of good and didn't run into these critiques.
Got it.
And the thought was like, so you have sort of competing values, but here's sort of like a sort of way to sort of get both what you want. This helps lots of people who need help, or animals, or future people, and there's not such a strong democratic case against it. And on certain views, it gets more complicated. There's even a democratic case for it. If you think democracy really should be, in some sense, representing these interests, maybe, this gets complicated, maybe philanthropy of certain sorts actually helps to come closer to democratic ideals of political equality, if you think, animals should be represented, or so on. So, that's sort of the idea. The valence is like, how do we take this problem seriously without running into it in this particular case?
Right. And so this is the problem with me hearing these first time through. It's like, okay, this is a pretty nuanced view. It's like, what kind of view? Nuance? What are we talking about? You're trying to take the problem seriously and take the critique seriously. And I like the analogy or the metaphor of threading the needle. You're trying to accommodate the good that philanthropy is doing and the democratic critiques that are there. But there are ways that can say. There are ways that you can avoid the democratic critiques, and you can also say that it's actually in the service of some democratic ideals.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
That's the hope.
Wow. Okay, that's a really ambitious project. You got another one that, in some ways, is a little bit orthogonal to it, because on the one hand, we've got to have a kind of a winnowing down and a kind of a little bit more of a principled approach to philanthropy, but then you've got another approach about, you might say, the diversity of views and diversity of skills and diversity of viewpoints for democracy, diversity and democracy program. So tell me about how this diversity program in democracy.
Yeah, good. So this is a sort of a brand new project. So the last one I talked to you about, is relatively polished and off at the journals. This one is like not even written yet. So so it might change, But the idea is, I guess you could sort of see the two projects being connected, because both are sort of about the limits and strengths of democracy. So the last one's sort of like a limit, and here philanthropy can maybe sort of help in these ways. The cases where democracies don't do so well, benefiting disenfranchised groups, maybe that's actually room for philanthropy. But also, I'm a Democrat. I'm not one of these sort of anti-democracy people, and so I'm also interested in sort of trying to think about sort of how to explain why democracy does do pretty well in lots of ways, right?
Okay.
And so I think there's sort of this puzzle that comes up in lots of the recent literature on democracy. Lots of it's not framed this way. It's often framed as sort of critiques of democracy and defenses. But I think you sort of get this puzzle, which is, on the one hand, we know democracies are pretty good at lots of stuff. There's a standard list of things you go through. They don't go to war as much. At least a lot of democracies, stable. Yeah. They don't have famines. They're good for growth. Maybe economic equality. Good for freedom, well-being.
Good for markets.
Good for all sorts of things. Correlated with subjective well-being, freedom measures, right? So we know democracies at macro level, they're pretty good. Then you look at the micro level evidence, and you
Yeah.
get a little worried.
You got that Churchill problem. Like Churchill had said that the best argument against democracy is 5 minutes with the voting neighbor.
Sure, yeah.
Exactly. Got an epistemic case against democracy
Exactly.
right there.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. You get more and more evidence coming out. People are ignorant, irrational, biased, not well motivated, and so on, right? And so this puzzle, putting it a little crudely, I don't like to talk about people as garbage, but crudely, why did you get garbage in, and why isn't garbage in, garbage out?
Yeah, right. That's a good question. That's a good question for us.
And so there's lots of answers you can give. You can dispute the characterization of the evidence. You can say, actually, it's not so great, or actually, the people are pretty smart. They use information heuristics or something. But I'm interested in this particular reply that says the reason democracies work pretty well is because they're able to harness diversity. And this reply has been closely associated with a particular way of defending it. So there's a book by Helene Landemore. She relies quite heavily on this particular formal theorem by Liu Hong and Scott Page, diversity trumps ability theorem, and to sort of argue that democracy does well because it harnesses diversity. And this particular version of the diversity view, has been sort of criticized on lots of grounds. Very roughly, the theorem doesn't say exactly what she glosses it as. It arguably doesn't apply in the real world, et cetera, et cetera. And so these critiques, I think, have been pretty persuasive and sort of have become sort of in vogue. It's like quite in vogue for someone writing, you might defend this, but of course that doesn't work, said all the people against diversity ability theorem. And so I think that something has sort of been lost in this exchange, which is that I think that the original idea, democracy harnesses diversity,
right? Yeah.
is quite plausible, and sort of reading the theorem too literally and criticizing it for not literally applying, I think sort of to some extent misses the forest for the trees.
Okay.
And so I want to write this paper that sort of is to some extent a sort of meta commentary on how to engage with formal results.
Okay.
But
a methodological lesson.
But I haven't yet decided again whether that would be explicit or just sort of implicit in the paper.
Okay.
But at the sort of object level, it's sort of arguing here is sort of the basic insight of the theorem. Here's sort of the mechanism that drives the result that under these very specific conditions, diversity trumps ability. And those mechanisms quite plausibly apply to real democracies in various ways, even though the theorem itself doesn't literally apply. So you're not going to get diversity trumps ability, but I think you can get something like diversity gives a bonus, right?
Okay.
And so if our argument isn't trying to show that democracy is like the best possible decision maker or something, but rather like just explain why democracies work pretty well, I think this is pretty plausible. And very roughly, the mechanism is a baton passing thing, right? Basically, the way that the theorem works, or sort of what drives the insight behind the theorem is, maybe I'm quite good at problem solving, but at some point I'm going to get stuck. I'm going to work and get stuck at a certain point, and then I'll say, okay, here's the best I can do. And the basic insight behind the theorem is a diverse group often gets stuck at different points. So I work as hard as I can, and I get stuck and hand it off to you. You have a different perspective on the world, you have different tools. You're able to build upon what I've done and get a little further. Then a third person is able to take the baton from you and work on it. And so I think what the theorem suggests is diversity really helps, not so much in other ways, but this theorem itself suggests that diversity helps not so much with selecting options as with searching the space of options to find a bunch of good ones that otherwise you couldn't find from a more homogeneous group.
Got it. And so and so it kind of works then like a kind of a you have lots and lots of points of view, not just all at once, but in some ways in series, working problems through.
Yeah, the idea that very roughly it's that diversity lets more people build on more people's solutions.
Okay, got it. And so the worry about the cacophony, right, of the conflicting views. The thought here is that it's that you've got the diverse views that are in some ways the ones that are willing to pick up the baton.
Yeah, exactly. So as long as you it's not going to work in all conditions. Basically what you need to get this mechanism going is at least that when someone else comes with a solution, I can at least see that as worth taking as a starting point for my own thinking.
Yeah.
So I can even think you're wrong. I can think it's a terrible idea. But if I'm willing to sort of try to build on that, I might get to something quite good.
Yeah.
And so that could happen because we share values and we both are trying to build the same thing. It could also happen because we're maybe in more of a bargaining context, and I'm trying to find something that might be acceptable to both of us. And so you built to something that I think is quite a bad idea, but I can see, but I can improve that from there. And we eventually get to something that hopefully is better than any of us would come up with our own.
So then, now the question would be, is there something unique about democracies that allow for that? Because now I'm just kind of imagining like certain kinds of constitutional protections of freedom of information and exchange and association would allow for that, and say like, well, those are pretty democracy-y kind of norms. But you can imagine, say, like a constitutional monarchy or something like that, having norms like that. Is there something unique about democracy qua democracy that has that, or could you still have inquiry like that going on, but it still be a one decider at the top, and they just have smart people telling them stuff?
That's a good question. So I told you the first piece of the paper. So the first piece of the paper is about search. The second piece is about selection. Well, let's stick on. So I think you're right that you could, in principle, have an ultimate decider. Who, once you sort of have all the options picked out, they choose one. So there's nothing unique about democracy. There's nothing about voting in what I've just told you, or in majority of decision making what I've just told you. It's more about sort of I'm thinking about actually existing democracies. So robust cultures of freedom of speech, robust civil society organizations, think tanks. Lots of people being included in the process, at least at different points. And so the thought is like it's more about sort of inclusion of diverse viewpoints.
Right.
Which you're saying you could get from...
democracy is good at harnessing that, but it's not. Is it uniquely good at harnessing that?
But then there's sort of the second piece of the paper, we don't have to go into the details, is then trying to rehabilitate, I know it's probably too much, the Condorcet jury theorem, right? So it's another formal theorem, which is all about selections. We don't have to go into the details, but I think a similar story can be told there, where, again, it doesn't literally apply, but it sort of tells us an important mechanism. Why majority decision-making or decision-making sort of by polling various people or aggregating their opinions can often lead to better results. And I want to suggest that, again, it's something like diversity that actually drives this. So if you poll a bunch, just take a really simple case, 1 million clones don't make a better decision than one, right? That's not the wisdom of crowds phenomenon. What makes better decisions is people having diverse biases, diverse errors, diverse sources of error. And so that's sort of, you get the error cancellation sort of thing going, that sort of drives the Condorcet jury theorem that I haven't talked to you about much.
Super, and that does sound like it's a considerably more democracy qua as opposed to democracy qua freedom of inquiry
or something.
Right. So you've done such a good job explaining this to me.
Oh, good.
I really appreciate that. I'm learning so much. I can only imagine what it must be to be one of your students. So tell me a little bit about the classes that you're teaching. You got some undergraduate classes. You're slated to teach the justice class for the philosophy and political science departments next spring. You also teach an intro ethics. You teach tell us about some of the undergraduate classes.
Yeah, sure. So the justice course you mentioned, it's called Justice, but it's really just like intro to political philosophy or theory. Okay. I actually taught it sort of with a justice focus, but I know when our colleague Rob Talese teaches it, he doesn't actually stick to the justice, which is, I don't mean to get him in trouble. It's permissible. So that's, it's actually written right in my contract. I teach that once a year because it's for the political science department as well. So I sort of teach that mainly as introduction to theories of justice. But I try to sort of go through it a bit historically too, so I think I'm going to change it a bit when I teach it next time. But last time the way I taught it was, the beginning was sort of like social contract theory, sort of, the very idea of like sort of needing some conception of justice, moving beyond Hobbes, and then the second unit was on approaches to justice focused on distribution, so the sort of debates that I was taught about, my intro political philosophy class, Rawls, Nozick, Cohen, this sort of thing. The third was then what I sort of called the relational turn in theorizing about justice. So the idea was, it maybe was too complex, but the idea was each unit was sort of both a different time period, but also a different topic, and so this was sort of like thinking about the idea that justice requires us to relate as equals, and looking a lot more very cutting edge work on that, beginning with Elizabeth Anderson in 1999, but also up to the present day. And the fourth unit was then, what about beyond our own society? So what about, we actually focused on immigration. I gave them sort of a choice, and but we could have done animals or future people or so on as well. So that's why I taught the justice class, and then I won't tell you about all the classes I'm teaching. Maybe that's too much. But I taught intro ethics, and then right now I'm teaching a course, ethics and law, for the second time, which is fun. My first time teaching the course for the second time is great.
So one of the great just delights of being a teacher is coming back to the material and saying, "Wow, I feel like I get this better. I'm better at explaining it." Just feeling those skills growing. So is that this semester?
Yes,
is it
exactly.
This fall? It's the second time around.
So I've just finished the first unit. Yeah, and that's pretty fun. That's it's ethics and law, and I'm teaching it very much as sticking to the titles. Like the first unit is, what is the relationship between ethics and law? So classic jurisprudence. Legal positivism versus critiques from Fuller and Dworkin and the like. We just finished Dworkin today.
Okay.
Had them read some Supreme Court cases. Looked at some old ones. I was hoping to get to Roe and Dawes, ran out of time by giving their handouts. And then. The next unit is sort of when should things be illegal, harm principle versus paternalism, legal moralism, and so on. The third is on legal punishment, when and why should we punish lawbreakers. And the fourth is on legal obedience and disobedience. Do we have an obligation to obey the law, and how should we disobey it? Does it have to be civil, or does it not have to always be civil?
The uncivil disobedience puzzles.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so that's at the undergraduate level, and then we've got you teaching some graduate seminars.
Yeah, that's right.
Am I right that you're teaching the ideal versus non-ideal
theory
seminar right now?
So I'm currently inflicting my draft on my graduate students. We're about halfway through. It's a short book.
Okay, yeah. The Cambridge Element things are all totally.
That's so that's sort of ideal non-ideal theory. I thought it'd be helpful for me to sort of talk about the book project and also sort of get myself going to as I mentioned, the other one. But also I thought it might be, I've never taught a course that's like on something I know super well. Do you know what I mean? Like, okay. I shouldn't say that. I've never taught a course on something I know that well. And so I thought it might be sort of fun to have a seminar where it's, students sort of take this course with me, which is something I've thought about a ton and get new perspectives on it. And I just did this lit review so I can sort of tell them all this stuff, and so I figured that might be fun for them and not just selfishly good for me.
Well, one thing's for sure is that as you're figuring things out, that actually does show up sometimes in the classroom where you're totally. Wow, look, and they sort of feel the magic of that. So there's some classroom magic that can happen.
Sure. I think so. And then last year I taught a graduate seminar on the epistemology of democracy. And that was sort of, in a sense, the paper I told you about was like my late term paper from that class.
Okay.
So that was all about, why do democracies, do they work well?
Do they work well and why?
Yeah.
And, but you got another one you were telling me a little bit about this last time we talked. You got another one in the works, which is a grad seminar on choice.
Oh, so actually an undergraduate course.
It's an undergraduate course. Okay, got it.
So that, I'm not sure if choice is the best term. I gave you that term. You
gave me that term.
But I think I told you. I'm not sure if it's right because it's not supposed to be about like pro-choice.
Still working on it.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, I'm hoping to at some point when I'm here start a PPE program, philosophy of political economics, and I've been thinking sort of in advance of actually starting the program, sort of getting the course that will become sort of the PPE 101 course going, and I was thinking of teaching it on different ways of thinking about both individual and collective choice. So individual choice, rational choice theory, and then sort of critiques from behavioral economics and so on, bounded rationality, strategic choice, in market settings or prisoner's dilemma, game theory type stuff, collective choice, so social choice theory, democracy, and then something roughly like what should we choose, theories of justice, right? And I thought that would be a nice package to get sort of a lot of the central elements you often talk about when doing sort of PPE classes into sort of a single framing. Like, how do individuals choose individually, collectively? How should they choose? And
it sounds like it would be methodologically pretty robust. It would be something where it's like, you've got a kind of not just a survey of topics, but you've got a survey
that's
of
exactly
approaches.
The idea. So I have this idea. I don't know if it's right, but I have this idea that that often if you want to teach sort of more formal stuff or stuff sort of outside people's wheelhouse, it can help, especially if it's someone who's come to the course because they want to do this. That's one thing. If you teach a course on formal models, you're going to get people. Yeah. But if you want to sort of teach this stuff to people who maybe aren't yet sure about the value of it or don't think of themselves as like formal mathy people, I find it can help, or I hope it can help, just sort of organized around particular topics rather than particular. So it's not like here's our unit on game theory.
Yeah.
It's here are the strategic contexts we face ourselves in. Here's one way people have tried to model it, to try to get a better handle on it, right? Yeah. That sort of thing.
Motivating the methods and the tools that we use to think them through. I think that
exactly.
selling it that way is really important. again, sounds like you're just such an awesome teacher.
Yeah,
I
hope so.
Going to be reading your stuff and wanting to take your classes. Feeling pretty jealous about all those folks. Jacob, thanks so much
thanks so much, Scott.
Spending some time talking with me. I really value you as a colleague and looking forward to more years with you.
Yeah, me too. I appreciate that. I feel like I didn't look enough in the camera. But
Well, that's okay. These folks have been looking at us.
Okay.